Hey folks, I'm Doxson Wedge, and today we're going to be talking about the one biggest tip I've found for taking better photos in Cyberpunk 2077. We actually have a really interesting opportunity because CD Projekt Red is having a photo mode challenge for Cyberpunk 2077. The theme of the first challenge is apartments. I unfortunately missed the deadline for this. I took the photo that I was going to submit, which I think will be the thumbnail of this. But I took the photo and then realized I missed the deadline. So I'll come back and do the next challenge on the 13th. But I wanted to come back and talk a little bit about this because I've been exploring the photo mode and ran into some interesting challenges with Cyberpunk 2077 that I haven't seen in other games. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the screenshots in the photo mode challenge and talk about a couple of them and what they do differently to make their photo work. I think that's a good starting place to start thinking about our own photos and start thinking about how we might improve. And then after that, I'm going to jump in and see if I can put some of the things I'm talking about into practice. So first off, before we jump into looking at some photos, I wanted to talk about what makes a photo good. This is something that we really can't get around if we're talking about photo tips and composition and tricks. It sort of presupposes that there is a good thing, a right thing, and a wrong thing. And that isn't really true. Without getting too much into it, what makes a photo good is if people like it, if a lot of people like it. That may not be what you're going for, and that's okay. Photos are subjective, they're an art form. If you're taking photos you like, then you can ignore these tips. These are not objectively correct tips. These are things you can do that tend to work for most people and make their photos look, in air quotes, better. That doesn't mean they are absolutely correct. That doesn't mean they're absolutely wrong. They're just something to think about and consider when you're taking your photos and trying to make your photos look more appealing, I guess is the right word. But again, what is appealing is subjective. Some of my favorite photos are photos that get 0 likes on the internet. And some of my least favorite photos are photos that do really well. And I expect that to be the same here too. So when we talk about these photos and we talk about what works and what doesn't work, I try to avoid calling these photos good or bad and just sort of point out the techniques used and how we might think about them in the future. Don't take any of this to be an absolute truth. Take the photos that you want to take and have fun is the main thing. So first up, I want to take a look at the photos in the photo mode challenge. Most of them are pretty good. I think people did a good job here. The two that I actually noticed that I think would be good to compare for this tip that I want to talk about is this runner and the guy on the floor over here, or maybe a guy, I can't tell from here. And the tip that I want to talk about is simplifying things down. So let's take a look at this one first. This one is actually doing some interesting things. So the jogger on the treadmill, I actually think that took quite a lot of effort to get. There isn't I don't think a stock pose for running. Maybe there is, but the timing on that is really interesting. It's awesome that they got the person on the treadmill doing the running animation to make it look like they're running. That's a really creative way to do this, and I think it works really well. But I think it's also a good example of what makes photo mode in Cyberpunk 2077 really, really challenging, and that is the complexity of the environments. So when you're taking photos, a lot of the times what you're trying to do is focus on a subject. What does that mean? When we're talking about, say, a portrait, you'll see a lot of portraits on Instagram or on popular photo sites have a blurred out background. And the reason for that is because they want you to focus on the subject of the photo. The subject of the photo in this case being the person. And that's called depth of field if you're not familiar. You can have a shallow depth of field and just focus on one area and keep the viewer's attention on the subject rather than getting distracted with a lot of background noise. And I think this photo has a really creative subject and a really neat idea for this pic, and then unfortunately has a lot of noise in the background that makes it hard to focus on that. So you see we've got lots of bottles and things in the background which are distracting. There's a line going off into the distance. There's lines out here that are also sort of distracting. Lines on the window that don't really lead to the subject. The subject actually has a table that cuts through that makes it sort of hard to see the subject. So I think this photo would actually be really improved just, and again, when I say improved, I mean like subjectively, could be improved by just turning on depth of field and keeping the subject in focus, and then letting the background get blurred out and losing some of the details in those background elements. I think you would still be able to see the shape of the mountain and the trees in the background, which you sort of like, and the lights that are also sort of good, but it would keep the focus on the person here rather than having your eye go to the person and then to the mess and then to this line that doesn't go anywhere and then around to the windows and trying to find other subjects that don't really exist. So I think that would be one really interesting way to bring the subject of this photo out a bit more rather than having a lot of noise in the background. And I wanted to compare that with, I think, this photo, which I think is actually a really similar photo in a lot of ways. The main character posed in a creative way in an apartment with some windows in the background. But you can see they've actually done this trick. They've centered the depth of field around their character. The windows are blurred out, and then we have lines pointing to where your eyes are supposed to go. So we've got the light shining through, which is sort of like a secondary subject. So you look at the player and then whoop into the light, and all the lines are pointing to the light because that's where the shadows are. You can see we've got other distracting elements in the image up here and down here, but they're all blurred out, so they don't take up as much mind space as they did in this photo, right? Whereas if we'd had all of this blurred out and then had the lines pointing to like a secondary subject, I think this photo would be pretty similar, in all honesty. So that's sort of what I think about when I'm doing Cyberpunk. It is actually a really hard thing to do in Cyberpunk, right? Like, look how detailed these environments are. There's a surfboard in the background. There's lots of bottles on the floor. There's an ottoman, a little leg rest here. Like, there's just so much stuff everywhere in these environments. It's really hard to get a simple photo. You'll see a lot of people, myself included, start doing things like this, where they just frame the photo in a very small area so they can keep the photo contained. And even here, you know, you've got some stuff going on in the background, some stuff on the side that adds some character to it and is okay. I think it works in this shot. But you gotta still be very careful with all the stuff going on in every little nook and cranny of this game. So yeah, that's the main thing that I wanted to talk about today, is like sort of learning and understanding the idea of keeping your subject in focus and trying to make the distracting elements, the noise in the background, fade away a bit in order to keep the viewer focused on your subject. But if you work hard and focus on doing that, I think it can make your photos really pop and stand out a bit more. Okay. So now that we've taken a look at some of those photos and gotten some ideas about how to simplify our photos and keep our subject in focus, I wanted to take a look at my idea of what I would have submitted had I been on time, and sort of how we got through that process. So looking around the apartment, I picked V's apartment. As you can see from the quest, I'm not super far in with this character. I'm doing an explosives build. But coming into the apartment and looking around, you've got this sort of area here, which is sort of a natural focus, I think. You've got the bed area here, which I've seen some people focus on. The bathroom could also be an area to focus on, although there's a lot of stuff going on with the mirror and things like that. Shower has some interesting lighting as well, but there's just not that much to focus on in here, aside from, you know, the shower. This wall, I think, is a bit busy. And same within here, I think it's just a bit busy. Not saying you can't do anything with it, but that was my initial impression. This corner is also pretty busy, so I think we'd need to do something with that. So I sort of focused on this as sort of the main thing to look at. And so what I wanted to do was start trying out some creative stuff with it. So for me, I'm an explosives build partly because I think explosions have cool effects. The problem is we can't actually use explosives in V's apartment. If you try to shoot, it won't let you. So, and I was messing around with EMP grenades. I think they sort of match the blue tones of this area pretty well. You can actually come out here. And if you come out here, make sure you save before you do this, because people are going to get scared. You come out here, you can actually take your grenade out and plan where you're going to land it for your photo. That's what I'm doing here, is I want the effects to be right underneath the column, so it looks sort of like part of the scene naturally. So we're gonna do that, run up, grab the photo as soon as it goes off. And this took me a little bit to actually figure out, because of the way the camera rotation works, it always rotates around the person. So if you're not like right in there, it can be hard to get the actual thing you're trying to get in focus. So I'm actually not close enough here to do what I wanted to do. So we're gonna have to try this again. But you can see those sparks and things look pretty cool. And I think they add a lot to the photo and sort of draw the eye in, add some extra lighting. And if you save, you can just retry this as many times as you want. Photographers and save scummers here. And this time I'm gonna run all the way up and get as close as possible. We even got some lightning this time. And I'm gonna remove my character. I typically do scenery photography, so that's sort of my default. I need to work on that a bit, but for now, that's my default. And you can see it's out of focus because of the depth of field. So what we want to do, we do want to keep the depth of field on, but we want to turn autofocus off because that focuses on the character. The focus distance is what will be in focus. So you can see if it's too close, it's the stuff in the foreground that's in focus. If it's further away, the other stuff in the background, midground is in focus. So I want this column to be in focus. 2.8, 3.4 looks pretty decent. And we're sort of aligned with the 2/3 line, which is good. I do like that they have that as the default. You have your thirds grid. You can see the lightning, I think looks pretty good. I actually really like this shot already. The sides over here aren't too busy because they're darkened from the contrast, and we'll do a little bit more with that in a sec. If we look down, this is the part that I'm not as sure about. These stools and things, I don't know if I want them fully in the shot. I think maybe like this. You still have them a little bit down here. They're a bit, I don't like having something cut off on the bottom like this. And maybe we want the camera's field of view to be different. Yeah. Still got a little bit down here, but it's dark enough that it doesn't distract, and we don't have the cutoff up here. We do have some lightning going off the screen here, which I think is okay. As long as these ones are the main focus. Yeah, I think that's always going to go off the screen, so we're just sort of stuck with that. It's all right. Depth of field, I think we want to bring this down a bit. This is gonna determine like how thin or thick the depth of field is if we bring the aperture down. So you can see it gives some blur to the sparks in the foreground and background while keeping this in focus, which I like. And then we go to effects. I think the other thing I wanna do is bring out the colors in the lighting and keep the darks darker. So what we'll do, bring up the light. Actually, I think what we want to do is bring up the highlights. Contrast some. Yeah. Typically when you bring the contrast up, you want the exposure to come up too a bit. The vignette, we sort of have a natural vignette because of the grenade explosion, but we can emphasize that with this vignette, which just darkens the outside and keeps the focus where we want it, which is on our column. So we got this inside, okay. And then I think for effect, looking through, there's some really crazy ones, but I think the 9 just helps with the blues and the oranges. It helps them pop a bit. I think that's about right for me. The only thing I'm a little worried about now looking back at this is the screen. So Cyberpunk has a lot of screens and signage, and you need to be aware of those or else they're gonna be distracting. So if you take a picture of this like mid-transition, it's gonna look really weird. And as it is right now, I think we have a problem in that the field of view is blurring the back half. So what I want is this eventually says 3 minutes. We wait for it. Trauma team, 3 minutes. That's the shot that I want. That's the one that I got before. And I think my depth of field is too shallow. Yeah, that looks a bit better. So something like this, what we want to do is grab it right when it says 3 minutes. And what I've noticed is that when you click the space bar, it's really immediate. So it's not like you have to wait. You just click it and it will get it right when you do the click. So yeah, this was roughly what I did for my photo. I think it came out pretty well. I played around initially with the fire grenade and just found that the fire explosion was too big. The red was not matching with the blue, so I switched to EMP, and I think the blue and orange of the EMP really complements the area. I want to try more stuff with the fire grenade and different types of grenades to see what effects we can get in here, but I think for now this is probably what I'm going to land on for today. That was my tip and trick. You can see we tried to keep the room simple and keep the edges clean, and any sort of distractions we did have, we wanted to blur out and keep focused on the subject that we have. This photo is a little imbalanced. Everything is going on the right, but there are some nice sparkles on the left, so maybe we could do something with that. But I'm pretty happy with how this turned out overall. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something, and I'll be back later, hopefully with the next photo challenge.